anyone heard from her. Pretty sure she still lives with her mom. The laughter moved through the ballroom like something rehearsed. Nobody noticed the wine trembling in their glasses. Not yet. Then, the floor shook. A low rotational thrum rising through the tables, through the linen, through the bones of everyone standing near those windows, until the champagne shivered and the silverware sang against the plates, and the entire room turned as one toward the dark field outside. A military helicopter, descending, landing lights sweeping the grass like a verdict. And when the ballroom doors finally opened, the woman they'd spent 10 years mocking walked in wearing a uniform. None of them recognized, carrying a silence that swallowed every laugh in the room whole. She didn't come for revenge. She came for dinner. What happens next will make you rethink every person you ever underestimated. Stay until the end, because the real twist isn't who she became. It's what she'd been quietly doing for someone else the entire time. The altimeter read 4,000 feet, and the city below was nothing yet. Just a smear of amber against the dark, waiting to resolve into something with edges. Sutton Ashwell worked the checklist the way she always worked a checklist. Item by item. Nothing skipped, nothing rushed. She corrected her heading 2 degrees west, for wind she could feel, before the instruments confirmed it. The airframe shook at a frequency she'd stopped noticing years ago. It lived in her hands now, in the base of her neck, in the way she held her shoulders without holding them at all. Somewhere below her, in a ballroom, lit it up like something out of a catalog, a room full of people were laughing at a photograph of a girl they used to know. Where are you watching from tonight? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if you're new here, subscribe before part 1 even starts. Because this story builds the way it needs to build. And you are going to want to be here when it lands. The Alderbrook Grand had been renovated twice in the 10 years since anyone from that graduating class had last set foot inside it, and the ballroom on the east side of the second floor carried the evidence of both attempts. A crown molding pattern that didn't quite match the original ceiling medallions. A floor refinished in a cooler shade of honey than the wood beneath it, except at the baseboards, where the old color still hid in the corners. The sanding machines couldn't reach. Odalis Brennicke noticed this while she bent to fix the strap of her shoe near the entrance. Then she stood and stopped noticing it, because the room was already full noise. People, the particular pressure that builds in any space where everyone is performing a version of themselves they don't quite believe in. She had driven 2.5 hours to be here, told herself the whole way that 10 years was a real marker. That the people you grew up next to were the ones who remembered who you'd been before you got the chance to choose anything for yourself. That there was something worth reclaiming in that. She wasn't sure any of it was true. She'd come anyway. The registration table was staffed by 2 women from the planning committee. Marguerite Doyle had been 2 years ahead of them and had become, in the years since, both the reunion committee chair and a real estate broker, a fact she communicated through a lanyard badge with her professional headshot printed on the back. Beside her stood a woman whose tag read Priya Kessington, in the same rounded font as everyone else's, a font that said warmth, community, the good years, and which resolved, after a second, into the Priya who had cried in a bathroom stall at junior prom and never told anyone why. Odalis collected her lanyard, read her own name, walked in. The room smelled the way ballrooms always smell, laundered linen, the mineral cold of an air system working too hard, and under that perfume, competing with cologne in the middle distance, thick with the heat of 40 gathered bodies. She took a glass of white wine off a passing tray, had meant to ask for sparkling water. The tray moved on before she finished deciding. She stood at the edge and let the room organize itself into something legible before she stepped further in, because that was what she always did. Identify the clusters first. The athletic contingent, 4 men, 2 women clumped near the bar, describing their training regimens to each other with the enthusiasm of people for whom the regimen had become the whole personality. The former AP students near the far wall, talking with the focused intensity of people who'd found the one safe person in the room. the committee members near the stage, still doing committee things, adjusting a display board, checking a tablet, moving with the proprietary energy of people who organized the evening and intended to remain its owners all night. And there was Corbin Wexley. She knew him by the way he stood before she'd even placed the face. Weight even on both feet, the posture of a man who had always assumed he occupied the center of whatever room he was in. Because he always had. He was heavier than she remembered. His hair was doing something that wasn't quite a recession but was gesturing toward one. And he was talking fast enough that Odalys understood he'd started drinking before he arrived. The woman beside him laughed. 3 others in the cluster laughed with her. Odalys watched from across the room and tried to find the joke. Then Corbin turned, and she saw the phone in his hand and the image on the screen, and she understood before she needed to move closer. She stayed where she was and watched the phone travel hand to hand. The laughter moved through the group, the way laughter moves when it's establishing membership. Not because the thing is funny, because laughing proves you're the kind of person for whom the thing is funny. Odalys knew this mechanism. She had used it herself once, a long time ago. In a cafeteria she still dreamed about sometimes, without meaning to. She set her wine glass on the nearest table. Picked it back up, because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. The photo was from the group chat that week. She had seen it when it first went up. A yearbook photo. Grainy, slightly stretched from being enlarged too many times. A young woman in a dark sweater, hair pulled back, not quite smiling. The expression of someone who had decided to produce the minimum required response for a school photograph, and had done exactly that. Underneath, someone had typed a caption. Anyone heard from her? Pretty sure she still lives with her mom. LMAO. The girl was Sutton Ashwell. The invitation had gone out to her specifically, not as an afterthought. Odalys had understood that the moment she read the thread, a deliberate choice. The kind that requires considerable faith in your own certainty about someone else's life. The stockroom at Greeley's Hardware had a break area behind it that no one could accurately call a break room. 2 folding chairs, a card table, a window at ground level that showed the underside of a loading dock. Fluorescent light, 1 tube flickering. It had been flickering for 2 months, and nobody had reported it, because nobody in the building believed a work order would fix it faster than time would. Sutton Ashwell sat in the left-hand chair on her dinner break and opened a paperback library book to the dog-eared page. Not dog-eared by her, she never folded pages. Dog-eared by someone before her, 19 years old. A night shift stalker's vest still on over her shirt. Hands that smelled like cardboard, and the specific plastic and dust smell of a big box hardware store at 11 at night. She was 3 chapters into an introductory aeronautics text she'd checked out from the Millbrook Falls Public Library 6 days ago. Renewed once already. She kept a separate notebook for it, cheap, spiral-bound, bought with money from doing Saturday inventory at the pharmacy. 2 blocks from her apartment, because she didn't like writing in library books. That was somebody else's property. You gave it back the way you found it, or better. She was working through a passage on lift coefficient, following an equation the book presented without fully unpacking it, one that asked her to hold 4 different values in her head at once while she worked the intermediate steps. The break room noised the compressor hum from the walk-in cooler next door. Someone's radio down the hall was around her the way highway noise is around you once you've lived near a highway long enough. Present. Not a consideration. She wrote a number in the margin of her own notebook. 1. 3. The lift coefficient at a 15-degree angle of attack. She sat with it a second before moving on. The library had ordered 2 more aeronautics texts that spring. She hadn't asked why. She'd found them on the shelf, with a post-it stuck to the cover, in careful block handwriting, Reserve. The reserve had expired by the time she found it. She checked the book out anyway. Nobody said anything. The man behind the reference desk, Aldous Rourke, 60-something, a cardigan in every weather never explained. He simply processed her renewals. Once, setting a returned book back on the desk, he looked at the spine, then at her, said nothing. Sutton found that more comfortable than if he'd said something. She turned the page. In the narrow white margin, beside a cross-section diagram, faint pencil, small and precise, figure this out. Not an annotation, not a clarification, a task. Left there by whoever had read this exact book before her. She read it, agreed with it the way you agree with a fact about the weather. The truth doesn't need your agreement, but you give it anyway because it's accurate. She didn't dog-ear the page, didn't mark it, read it, kept going. Her break ended in 4 minutes. She had time for one more calculation. She used it. Back at the Alderbrook Grand, the room had reached the stage of social momentum, where nearly everyone had a drink and had located one person they were comfortable standing near, and the sound had climbed high enough that individual conversations were starting to dissolve at the edges into a general wash. Odalys was on her second glass of wine, hadn't meant to be standing beside a woman named Renata Kolk who'd been in her AP English class, and was now, apparently, a speech-language pathologist 4 hours north. Odalys found this both impressive and mildly disorienting, not because it was unexpected. Because an entire decade of professional identity wasn't visible anywhere in the face across from her, which looked exactly the way it had always looked, just more organized. Renata was describing a case study in careful, general terms. Odalys was listening with most of her attention. The rest of it stayed peripheral. Scanning. She was tracking Corbin's cluster. The phone had gone back in his pocket, but the energy of the joke was still there, still moving through the group, the way a sound keeps resonating after its source has stopped. Odalys was trying to figure out whether it would dissipate, or whether it would simply carry forward into the night and become the thing the whole evening organized itself around. "You expecting someone?" Renata said. Odalys looked back at her. "No. Sorry, you keep checking the door." "I don't think I am." Renata raised an eyebrow. "Let it go." Odalys turned so her back was mostly to the entrance and gave Renata her full attention. She'd already clocked, in the glance before, that one seat at the far table near the east windows still had an unclaimed name card propped against the votive. She hadn't read the name from that distance. She didn't need to. She already knew. The library's aeronautics shelf had grown by one more title by the time Sutton turned 20. She'd read the original text 3 full times by then and was working through it a 4th, not to recover the content, but to see what she'd missed the first 3 passes. That was a different kind of reading. It asked for a different kind of attention. Rourke had never mentioned the ordering. The books simply appeared. And when the reserve slip expired, she took what was hers to take, which was by an unspoken agreement. Neither of them had bothered to name out loud whatever showed up next. She sat in the reading nook at the back of the library, the one with the table against the wall and a window facing the staff parking lot, instead of the courtyard, because that meant fewer people walked past, which meant fewer interruptions. She'd found something in the third reading that she was now trying to trace forward into the newer text, a pattern in how different authors arrived at the same aerodynamic principle through completely different mathematical routes. The physics was identical. The path wasn't. She'd written in her own notebook, 2 ways to the same answer means you can check one against the other. She thought there was something important in that. She was trying to find out exactly what. Outside, the late afternoon had gone from neutral gray to the flat amber that happens when low western sun hits a concrete face at an angle, which told her she had maybe 40 minutes before the library closed. She turned the page. In the margin, beside a different diagram, a different hand, smaller, rounder, but the same pencil weight, the same instruction. Figure this out. 2 different texts, 2 readers who'd never met, maybe separated by years, both arriving at the same white space with the same impulse, both breaking the unspoken rule about writing in library property, both leaving the same task behind for whoever came next. Sutton looked at it for a long moment. She did not write in the margin. She never had, and she wasn't going to start, but she opened her own notebook and wrote there instead. The margin note is not the margin note, it's instructions. She wasn't entirely sure yet what she meant by that second sentence. She let it sit. Sometimes a thought needed the notebook to hold it, before finished forming. By 8:15, the Alderbrook ballroom had settled into its dinner rhythm. Servers moving the second course. Conversation dropping into the lower, more genuine register that shows up once people are actually eating instead of performing. Corbin had drifted to the corner between two tables, standing, not seated, which meant he'd either finished eating fast or hadn't sat down at all. He was directing conversation toward an empty chair, 3 tables over, toward the unclaimed name card. A posture Odalus recognized. The joke performed not at the subject but toward the subject, which was a worse and more durable kind. The laughter around him arrived at intervals, not cruel exactly, just available. The kind of laughter that shows up once someone's set the frame and the frame is running, and laughing is simply what you do while you're standing inside it. Odalus set down her fork, picked up her water glass instead, held it. Across the room, near the east windows, a man named Weston Okafor, 12 years into banquet service, somewhere north of 800 events, like this one, behind him, finished restocking ice in the cooler beneath the bar cart and straightened up. He knew this room's particular signature, louder than a genuinely happy room. Laughter arriving slightly ahead of where it should. Pauses a half-beat too short for anyone to really mean what they were saying. He had a private name for nights like this. Obligation evenings, the kind where most of the guests are there, because not showing up would have cost more than showing up did. He counted the open bottles on the cart. 3 white, 1 red. 1 empty flagged it for removal. 40 minutes before his next scheduled pass. The room was running at a predictable pace, which meant the next 40 minutes should be uneventful. He began breaking down the cocktail hour ice setup. 2 years before that reading nook afternoon, Sutton had walked into the county recruiting office on a Tuesday because it was the only day her shift schedule left open, and had left 90 minutes later with a folder of paperwork and a date circled on a calendar in her apartment. She had told her mother the practical parts, the financial structure, the training timeline. They talked about it the way they talked about most practical things, plainly, without decoration. What she hadn't told anyone, not because it was a secret, more because there was a difference between talking about a thing and doing the thing, was the actual texture underneath it. The pre-dawn report times. The instructor who spoke almost entirely through the absence of comment. The night she found a transposed digit in her own navigation log at 17 minutes into her first cross-country solo and corrected it in 90 seconds flat, alone, with nobody watching, because that was the entire job. That part lived in a different notebook, the one she kept for herself. Sergeant Milo Thackeray communicated primarily through economy. His response to a good flight log was the absence of a response which was also, unhelpfully, his response to an acceptable but not good one. The difference usually surfacing only later, in some subsequent debrief, when it was too late to ask which one you'd turned in. She remembered the first time he'd put her track up on the chart table and set one finger on the point where it diverged from the plan. "You were flying the plan," he said. "Not a question, yes. A plan is a prediction." He didn't look up from the chart. Actual conditions are data. When the data doesn't match the prediction, which one do you update? The plan, he nodded once. Rolled the chart. You corrected it. That's in the record. A pause. So is the original deviation. He set the chart down. Both facts matter. The record isn't selective. She had carried that line for years now, the way you carry the handful of sentences someone says to you at exactly the moment you're capable of hearing them. The MC returned to the microphone at 8:35. Bartholomew Doyle Marguerite's cousin, apparently, though nobody at Table 9 seemed entirely sure, Howe had the easy relationship with a room that some people develop out of genuine enjoyment of moving a crowd through a sequence, rather than any real comfort with attention itself. All right, he said, tapping the mic once. Time to catch up with each other properly. The icebreaker exercise involved printed cards. Find 3 classmates whose cards completed your set. Odalus drew a card with a mountain on it. She found Guadalupe Fan from her old chemistry section, now a pediatric nurse at the children's hospital downtown. Then a man named Desmond Boyle, who recognized her with the warmth of someone who remembered her a good deal better than she remembered him. She felt the small, familiar guilt, returned the smile, moved on. Her third match was Corbin. He crossed the room toward her with the same directional confidence he'd always had the assumption of welcome, because he'd never once needed to earn it, card raised like proof. Odorless, he grinned. You look exactly the same. Hi, Corbin. Still in the city? I am. She didn't ask if he was. He told her anyway. Finance, mid-market investment firm, vice president. The trajectory had been good. The hours brutal, but the kind of brutal that complements itself. He smiled after each sentence, with the ease of a man who'd delivered this exact summary before, and watched it land the same way every time. Odorless nodded at the right intervals. Then his weight shifted. Did you see the group chat thing? He didn't wait for an answer. You think she actually shows? The question wasn't really a question. It was an invitation to be an audience for whatever scenario was playing out in his head. Kind of hoping she does, honestly. Would be something. Odorless looked toward the east windows, dark glass. Nothing visible but parking lot amber on the far grounds. I don't know, she said. He laughed like she'd agreed with him. She hadn't. He moved off toward his fourth card. Odorless was still holding the mountain card. She set it on the nearest table, without looking at it again. The night navigation exercise had come in the third week of an 8-week instrument and low visibility training block, and the conditions on the night of the run had been deliberately unfriendly. A 2,000-foot ceiling, 4 miles visibility in mist, legally flyable, but nowhere near comfortable. The training standard required you to meet a new skill under demanding conditions. Not friendly ones, because comfort range competence produces pilots who can perform exactly as well as their comfort range allows and fail completely outside it. Sutton was at altitude, position lights running, cloud base pressing down, the two small towns along her route, resolving through the mist as smears of amber rather than distinguishable landmarks. At waypoint 4, the actual wind 3 knots stronger than forecast, 2 degrees off the briefed direction called for a heading correction she could see reflected in her own instruments. She didn't apply it. She held the planned heading, ran the plan instead of the conditions. The resulting deviation wasn't dangerous. It was the kind of small drift that, left unchecked over multiple legs and worse visibility, becomes the kind of error that ends careers. Or worse. She corrected it 2 legs later, once the compounding drift became impossible to ignore. Brought the aircraft home. Clean landing. The debrief was the next morning. Thackeray had her track already plotted when she walked in. You were flying the plan, he said again the same sentence. Months apart, and this time, it landed with an entirely different weight, because this time she understood exactly what it cost her to hear it twice. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then both facts matter. He rolled the chart. Same time Monday, check weather at 0600. She left before the sun was fully up. The flight line was quiet, except for a generator hum from the maintenance hangar, where a crew had been working since midnight on a gearbox that had grounded one of the primary training aircraft. She sat in her car with the door open, feet on the cold asphalt, and didn't start the engine right away. Took out her personal notebook, wrote the deviation, the correction, and underneath it, not as a quote but as the principle it carried, the record is complete, not selective. She sat with that a while. Somewhere across the field, an aircraft beacon pulsed red, then white, then red again, the rhythm of a machine waiting to be useful. She closed the notebook, started the car, drove. At 8:52, Bartholomew called the room back to their tables for the seated portion of the program, and people did the thing rooms do after roaming free for an hour. Reading the seating chart, reading it again, finding their assigned places with the slightly deflated posture of people who'd spent 45 minutes at liberty and were now expected to sit still again. Odorless found table 9. Guadalupe was already across from her. Desmond had pulled his chair over from table 11, which Odorless found she didn't mind. From 9, she had a clean sightline to table 6, against the east wall. 3 tables from the window's nearest edge, 7 of its 8 seats filled with people. She could half place from this distance someone who might have been in her biology section. 2 women she didn't recognize at all, a couple sitting with the matched posture of people who'd been together long enough to move the same way without noticing. The 8th chair, at the far end nearest the glass, had a name card propped against the votive. Undisturbed, unclaimed. Priya was seated at the table beside it, and Odalis heard her clearly when she said, without lowering her voice at all, "I guess she's not coming." A beat. Are we surprised? The people around her produced various versions of laughter. Priya's expression timed the line, the way you time a joke you'd already worked out in advance slightly ahead of the room's arrival at it, satisfied with a calculation that had come out exactly the way she expected. Odalis looked at the empty chair for a long moment. She didn't eat much of her salad course. There was a scholarship criteria form Satan had downloaded and read at the library 3 weeks before her 20th birthday, back when she'd briefly considered a civilian flight program before the recruiter's paperwork changed her math. The form had used the phrase demonstrated community investment 3 separate times without once defining it. She had asked the woman across the desk, plainly, what the phrase actually meant. Participation in organized activities. With other people. I work Saturday mornings at the pharmacy. That reads as financial necessity, not community contribution, even if it's both. Sutton had looked at the paper for a moment, noted that it didn't define itself anywhere on the page. What happens if I apply with just the employment record and the transcript and address the rest directly in the essay? Truthfully, you'd be fighting a committee's assumptions with a limited reading window. Most applications look the expected way. Yours gets read against that expectation and comes up short in the exact category. The form tells them to wait first. Is it a disqualification? Not technically stated as one. Then it's still viable. The woman across the desk had looked at her for a second, not the look adults give you when they're bracing to say something discouraging as kindly as they can. A different look, the one you give someone who's already arrived at the conclusion and is only waiting to see if you'll confirm it or try to redirect it. It's viable, she'd said. It's a long shot. Sutton had nodded, circled the deadline in her planner on the walk out, because a deadline circled exists in the physical record, not only in the mind, and gone back to work. She never did submit that application. The recruiter's offer came through 9 days later, with a training pipeline that didn't ask her to prove she belonged to anyone's version of a community. At 9:17, the wine in Odalis's glass had gone warm in her hand, and she hadn't noticed drinking any of it in a while, and the room around her had reached the low, settled hum of a dinner mostly finished and a program not yet resumed. That was when the water glass nearest the east wall trembled. Barely. A shiver across the surface. The reflected light of the nearest candle catching and scattering, and then steadying again. Nobody at that table reacted, because it was nothing yet, because it was below the threshold of a thing you'd mention out loud. Then the champagne flute beside it shifted a ½ millimeter. And shifted back. Then the silverware at the same place setting produced something that wasn't quite a sound, more a sensation, a very small vibration climbing up through the linen, into the tabletop, into the chair legs, into the floor beneath everyone's feet. The people nearest the windows felt it first. A woman at table 5 stopped mid-sentence. A man at table 7 looked down at his own hands, like they might explain something. The laughter around Corbin's corner didn't stop right away. Laughter has momentum. It finishes what it started even when the room around it changes shape. But it shortened, arrived at its own end with less behind it than it had planned to have, and then the room went quiet, in the specific way a room goes quiet. When everyone's attention has shifted at once, and nobody has decided yet what it's shifted toward. Weston Okafor was already looking through the glass. Hands at his sides, his bottle count abandoned on the cart behind him, because he'd felt it before his ears had caught up to it, registered it in his chest first. A pressure, a frequency with no distinct pitch yet, the kind of thing that arrives in the body before the brain finishes cataloging what it is. He didn't need long to place it. he already knew. Out past the manicured slope behind the hotel, past the boundary where the parking lot's amber light gave out into full dark, something was descending. Not the fixed glow of a perimeter lamp, a moving light, directional, purposeful, coming down. Petra Odalis rather was at the windows with maybe 40 other people by then. The movement toward the glass gradual, and then suddenly not gradual at all. First the ones nearest the east wall, who'd felt the vibration earliest and were already half-turned. Then the tables beside them, drawn along by the simple contagion of other people's attention. Then, within about 90 seconds, the bar, the stage, the far side of the room, nearly the whole space migrating east, leaving half-eaten plates and trembling glasses and burning votives behind them in the sudden emptiness. Priya was 3 people to Odalis's left, phone raised at head height, screen out, elbows working with the practiced efficiencies of someone for whom this had become instinct rather than choice. Corbin was further left, near the window's corner section, hands cupped around his eyes against the glass. "Is that what I think it is?" someone said. Nobody answered, because the aircraft was answering for itself. It came down slow, slower than the eye expected, with a deliberateness that read almost like reluctance right up until it resolved unmistakably into total control. The lights had separated into distinguishable pieces now, a landing light, position lights, the sweep of a handheld spotlight across the grass that steadied once it found its mark. Around the aircraft's dark shape, rotor wash pressed outward in a widening circle, flattening the field grass, sending a visible ripple toward the tree line. The type wasn't clear to most of the people pressed against that glass. Distance and dark stripped away the fine detail and left only shape, sound, and the unmistakable weight of the moment. But something about it, the form of it, the noise of it, the way security vehicles at the field's perimeter had already arranged themselves with the practiced spacing of people executing a plan they'd rehearsed, told everyone in that room, without anyone needing to say the word out loud, exactly what category of thing this was. Military, official, arranged. Odalis watched it settle onto the grass. Couldn't quite see the point of contact from this angle. The rotor noise dropped from operational to idle, and the grass slowly gave up its flattened posture, and the security vehicle headlights held steady on the aircraft's dark shape. And for one long moment, the field outside was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the actual absence of sound. The room behind her wasn't fully silent either. 40-some people breathing. The ventilation system, the low idle of the aircraft carrying faintly through the glass. But the performed social noise, the party noise, was completely gone. What remained had a different texture entirely. Odalis realized she'd been pressing her wine glass to her collarbone without noticing when she'd started. She adjusted her grip, looked back at the field. The rotor idled, the security lights held. Somewhere out there, in the cockpit of that aircraft, someone was going through a shutdown sequence with the same unhurried precision they'd have used for anything else. Because that was simply how the job got done, at every stage, whether or not a hotel full of strangers happened to be watching. And inside the ballroom, 60 feet from the windows, an unclaimed name card still sat propped against a votive candle at table 6, waiting for the seat it had been printed for. The Apache's rotor dropped from idle to silence in stages. Not a stop, a decision made in increments, blade by blade, until the field outside the Alderbrook Grand held nothing but the tick of cooling metal and the low murmur of security radios. Lieutenant Reyes Colton stood at the aircraft's left side at the appropriate distance, waiting. 26 years old. 14 months in Sutton's unit. He had the one quality she valued most in the people under her command. He executed the job without narrating the execution. "Timeline's good, Captain." He checked his watch. 1947. Sutton climbed down. The grass was wet under her boots, dew coming early tonight, the temperature dropping faster than forecast, and she adjusted her first step for it without making a thing of it. "Tell Ferris to be ready at 2200. Unless you hear different, copy." She looked toward the hotel, second floor. East face lit up window by window, and behind the long band of ballroom glass, a dense arrangement of faces and raised phones, the particular quality of a crowd, watching something at close range, together, without yet knowing what to do with it. She'd expected the crowd. A helicopter landing 200 meters from a hotel isn't subtle. People go to windows when they hear things. It wasn't a consideration. She spoke briefly with the senior security officer at the perimeter vehicle, then turned toward the flagstone path leading to the hotel's east entrance. Colton fell in beside her, didn't say anything, because there was nothing left that needed saying. The path ran roughly 90 meters, lit by low bollard fixtures spaced every few yards. Grass trimmed close on either side, the way hotel grounds get trimmed when the hotel wants you to notice the price point from the outside. Sutton had clocked that detail 2 days ago, reviewing the site diagram. She noticed it again now, differently. The way you notice something when your boots are actually on it. "Dinner's mid-service," she said, based on the coordinator's last contact. "Yes, ma'am. I'll check in at the registration table, find my seat." Copy that. That was the whole conversation. It covered everything that needed covering. The east entrance came into view, glass doors under a recessed awning. The lobby behind them, bright, carpeted, quiet compared to the field. She walked toward it the way she walked toward most things directly in front of her. Which was directly. The lobby carpet was a deep neutral that swallowed the sound of boots almost entirely, and the registration table, serving the reunion, sat against the south wall, staffed now by only Marguerite Doyle Priya, having joined the migration to the east windows some 10 minutes earlier. Marguerite was on her phone when Sutton crossed the lobby from the east entrance. She looked up. She looked up again, and this time her phone lowered. Slowly, until it hung at her side, forgotten, because there is a particular kind of double take that happens when the face in front of you and the name in your program don't collapse into the same person fast enough. Marguerite's face did that work in real time. Recognition arriving late, arriving wrong, arriving, finally, correctly, and landing somewhere she clearly hadn't prepared for. "Brooke," she caught herself. Corrected, Sutton Ashwell. "Sorry." A short, strange laugh that had nowhere to go. "You're early? You're here, Ashwell," Sutton said evenly. "Not unkind, just precise. Name should be under A." Marguerite's hands moved across the name cards laid out in alphabetical rows, and she found it, and passed it across the table, along with a lanyard, still visibly recalibrating. "Sign the guest book," she said. Her voice had gone slightly over-calibrated. The neutral tone of someone managing a register she wasn't entirely in control of anymore. The guest book was a large hard cover, with a photograph of the school's front entrance on the cover, taken in early morning light that made the brick look more dignified than it ever had during actual school hours. Sutton took the pen on its ribbon, opened to the current page, signed her name in the next open line. The pen ran dry at the end of the last consonant. She pressed fractionally harder, and it came clear. She capped it, replaced it, looked at the room ahead. "Stairs or elevator?" "Stairs are right through there," Marguerite pointed. Then, before Sutton could turn, "We weren't sure you'd actually." Sutton looked at her. Didn't finish the sentence for her. Just waited, the way she waited on a runway for clearance, patient and entirely unbothered by the silence. Marguerite didn't finish it either. "Through there," she said again, quieter. Sutton went through. On the second floor, the ballroom's double doors were closed, and the sound of the room behind them was muffled enough that she couldn't read its quality yet. Just a mass of presence on the other side, waiting to become legible. She looked at the lanyard in her hand, turned it over. Read her own name badge, Sutton Ashwell, printed in the same rounded font as everyone else's, class year underneath. She put it over her head, tucked the badge flat. The weight of it against her chest was the weight of any lanyard at any institutional event, barely perceptible. The kind of thing you stop noticing inside the first 30 seconds. She opened the doors. She went in. 2 years before that night, before the Apache, before the field, before any of it, Sutton had sat across a desk from Sergeant Milo Thackeray on the morning after her first serious navigational error, and the room had smelled the way it always smelled during a debrief. Chart paper, burnt coffee from the drip machine on the counter that he made for himself and never once offered to anyone. Thackeray communicated primarily through economy. He'd had her navigation log open on the table between them. And he went through it, without any theater at all. The systematic attention of someone who checks, not because he expects to find something wrong, but because checking is what the job actually requires of a person who takes it seriously. He found the transposed digit in about 15 seconds. Set one finger on the column. Walk me through this. She had the discovery, the identification, the recalculation, using the words available to her and none that weren't. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. What do you change in the planning stage? She'd thought about it, genuinely, which Thackeray either expected or required, and she still hadn't determined which. An independent check of the transcribed number against the calculation that produced it. Not a review of the math, a check of the transcription. When does the check happen? Before the log closes, before the flight. He'd looked at the log again, closed it, pushed it toward her. Be at the field 0500, he said. Weather window. She'd taken the log and left. That was the version of the debrief she remembered most. But there had been others, because errors compound if you let them, and the job of a good instructor is to keep handing you the next one, before the last one finishes teaching you everything it has to teach. The second one came 8 weeks later, a night navigation exercise, deliberately unfriendly conditions, and a wind correction she'd seen coming and hadn't applied fast enough, a small drift, the kind that compounds if it goes unchecked. She'd corrected it 2 legs late, brought the aircraft home clean anyway. You were flying the plan, Thackeray had said. The same sentence, months apart, and this time it landed with an entirely different weight, because this time she understood exactly what it cost her to hear it twice. Yes, a plan is a prediction. He hadn't looked up from the chart. Actual conditions are data. When the data doesn't match the prediction, which one do you update? The plan. He'd nodded once. Rolled the chart. You corrected it. That's in the record. A pause. Long enough to mean something. So is the original deviation. Both facts matter. The record isn't selective. She had carried that sentence for 2 years now. The way you carry the handful of things someone says to you, at precisely the moment you're capable of hearing them. Because it wasn't really about navigation logs. Not by the 3rd or 4th time she turned it over in her head, alone, driving home in the dark. It was about every version of herself that had ever existed in someone else's account of her, the stalker on the night shift. The girl in the yearbook photo nobody bothered to update, the person, a room full of strangers, had apparently decided to remember as a punchline. Both facts mattered. The correction didn't erase the deviation. The deviation didn't erase the correction. The record was the record, complete, not selective. She had built a career, quietly, on believing that sentence was true. Tonight was going to test whether the rest of the world believed it too. The room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when the door at the far end opens. And nobody's quite sure why yet, a silence that starts small, at the back, and spreads forward through the crowd, the way water spreads through fabric. One person's turned head, triggering the next, until the whole congregation at the windows has either kept looking at the field or started looking at the door. Instead, Odalys turned, along with everyone else. She saw Sutton before she could fully process what she was seeing. A woman coming through the ballroom doors the way anyone comes through a door at the end of a walk they've already completed in their head. Oriented, unhurried, having already noted, somewhere on the stairs, exactly where her table was and what the room's layout required of her path. The doors closed behind her. She had already moved past the closing. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed, and Odalys had only felt it once before at a funeral, 3 years back, in the gap between the music stopping and the minister beginning to speak, a silence with its own weight. The kind that forms when everyone in a room is holding the same breath without agreeing to. It wasn't recognition yet. Not exactly. It was that the room had already been primed for something it didn't have language for the aircraft on the field, the security vehicles, the deliberate, rehearsed choreography of the landing, and all of it had built a pressure that needed somewhere to go, and the somewhere had just walked through the door. Sutton found the lanyard station near the entrance without breaking stride, and settled the badge against her collar without checking it. Then she moved into the room. Corbin had drifted toward the registration area sometime in the last 2 minutes and was standing in the gap between the first tables when Sutton passed the outer cluster of people near the entrance. He started a sentence. Odalis couldn't hear it from that distance, but she could see him start. Could see the shape of his mouth opening around the first syllable of something. And she could see that Sutton's trajectory didn't adjust. Not even slightly. The brief allocation of attention was visible. For exactly a fraction of a second, some minor shift in the orientation of her head, and then it was gone, and her path continued exactly as it had been, because she had a table. The table was where she was going. A half-started sentence in her peripheral field wasn't a reason to alter course. Corbin didn't finish the sentence. Weston Okafor, watching from the bar cart near the east windows, found the room's reorganization interesting in the professional sense, the same sense in which reunion nights were always interesting to him, not because he cared about the particular people or their particular dynamics, because a room that has just had a structural event reorganizes differently than a room in ordinary motion, and the shape of that reorganization tells you something true about where a room's actual center of gravity was sitting before the event. The obvious center, before tonight, had been the man in the middle of the room, with the phone. That center was gone now. Not declared gone, just gone the way weather changes, without anyone needing to announce it. The new center was a woman walking to her seat, doing nothing remarkable at all. He watched the room respond to that ordinary action, the way a room responds to something it has no prepared frame for, which was to take it in, quietly, without knowing yet what to do with it. People returning to their chairs not because the evening had resumed, but because the evening was happening, whether they had somewhere to stand for it or not. He went back to the count, 3 whites open, 1 red untouched. He should get another red open before the third course. Sutton sat at table 6 with a glass of water. She poured herself from the pitcher, already sweating on the linen, and she looked at the program card propped against the votive, the printed outline of the evening's remaining agenda, the alumni update segment listed near the bottom, the committee names beneath it as organizers. She read it the way she read most printed material at events like this. Once, for information. No more attention than the information required. The program listed an alumni update segment. She'd submitted her entry through the standard channel. Weeks ago, a form the committee had emailed out, completed and returned 4 days before the deadline. Name, class year, current role, optional note. She had filled each field accurately and nothing more. At the bottom, in smaller type than the segment headers, 1 line, alumni update contributions have been compiled and will be read aloud this evening. She turned the card over, blank on the back, set it down beside the votive. Around her, the table was reassembling itself. The couple who'd arrived together were back in their chairs. Posture matched the way it gets when 2 people have been together long enough to move identically without noticing. A man she thought might have been in her old biology section was returning from the windows with the look of someone doing math, and arriving at an answer he wasn't entirely prepared for. He sat, arranged his silverware, looked at the empty seat at the far end opposite Sutton, then at Sutton herself. Sutton looked at the program card again, then lifted her water glass and held it. It was completely still in her hand, not effortfully still. She wasn't pressing her wrist to the table for stability or bracing against some tremor she was working to suppress. It was simply still, because her hand was simply still, and that was the baseline, the ordinary condition of her hands at rest, the same frequency that had moved every glass on the east side of the ballroom 40 minutes ago. The aircraft's idle, residual now, a trace instead of a presence, barely felt through the floor, and the table legs reached her too. It registered, it didn't enter. She drank. Aldous Rourke had known Sutton Ashwell for 6 years. by the time she stopped needing the public library's aeronautics shelf. And in all that time, he had never once told her why the reserve slips kept appearing on new arrivals before anyone else had a chance to check them out. He'd thought about telling her 100 times, never had, because his daughter had died at 21, an aneurysm nobody saw coming, 3 weeks into her second year of a flight science program, 4 states away, gone in the space of an afternoon that started ordinary and ended in a hospital hallway he still sometimes dreamed about, and she had loved exactly the kind of book Sutton kept walking out with, the dense ones, the ones written for people who wanted the mathematics, not the metaphor. His daughter had written in library books too. He'd found out only after she was gone, going through her own copies at home, the personal ones she'd owned, outright margins full of the same small, precise handwriting, the same instructive impulse. Figure this out, scrawled beside a diagram she hadn't yet solved, but fully intended to. He kept 2 of her books on a shelf in his own apartment that nobody but him ever saw, and when Sutton had first started coming into the library 19, in a stalker's vest, checking out the introductory text with the kind of care that told him everything he needed to know about how she'd been treated by whatever institutions had processed her. Up to that point, he had done something he'd never fully examined the reasoning for. He had started copying his daughter's margin notes, by hand, into the new arrivals, before he shelved them. Not all of them, just the ones that felt right, the ones that matched the exact place in a text where his daughter herself had, once, stopped, stuck, and pressed her pencil into the white space out of sheer stubborn refusal to move on until she understood. Figure this out. He told himself, for years, that it was a harmless thing, a private ritual that helped him more than it helped anybody reading the books. He never expected anyone to notice a pattern in it, never expected anyone to care. He had not expected Sutton Ashwell to become the kind of reader who noticed everything. Between the second and third courses, servers moved through the ballroom with the practiced neutrality of people whose job is to attend you, regardless of what the room happens to be doing, and the conversations that had stalled out at the windows were restarting with the particular strain of conversations, resuming after something large has interrupted them, a performance nearly everyone in the room was attempting, and nobody was fully pulling off. Odalis took the long way back to her own table. This wasn't, strictly, a decision she'd finished making. It was a pattern she was starting to notice in herself as the evening went on, doing things before she'd fully decided to do them, moving toward the windows before deciding to move, now taking a route that curved past table 6 instead of straight back to 9, and she genuinely could not have told you, if pressed, exactly when that decision had been made or by which part of her. She stopped near the edge of table 6. There wasn't a graceful version of this available to her. She hadn't planned. It hadn't rehearsed a graceful version in the car on the drive over, the way you rehearse those things sometimes, alone, at a red light, running through what you'd say, if the moment ever actually arrived. Can I sit? Sutton looked up. She'd registered the approach in the last few feet of it, the slight shift in orientation, the peripheral attention. She assessed the question, looked at the chair nearest Odalis, the corner seat, not directly across. Sure. Odalis sat, not across, at the angle. She put her drink down. She had not thought through what she was going to say, and that hadn't changed in the 30 seconds since she'd stopped walking. I didn't know if you'd come. Sutton looked at her with the same quality of attention she'd given the program card. Patient, complete, not invested in where the sentence was going. I was at the base, Sutton said. The invitation came through while I was there. They put your picture in the chat. I know, I saw it, Odalis said. Her hands moved around the drink she'd just set down, then picked it back up, needing something to hold. I laughed. When it went up, she hadn't planned to say that either. It had been there before she'd finished assembling it. The same way the walk to the display board had been there before she'd decided on it. Sutton's expression didn't change, didn't soften, didn't harden. The patience in it wasn't performing neutrality at her. It was genuine, the expression of someone who wasn't afraid of silence and would give it whatever room it needed. "I don't know why I'm telling you that," Odalis said. "Maybe because it's true." Odalis set the drink down again. The table had the faint humidity of a surface that had held condensating glasses all evening, and her glass left a wet ring on the linen, and she looked at that ring for a second before looking back up. "How did you end up in aviation?" Sutton looked at the table for a fraction of a second, not evasive, just selecting the version of the answer accurate and complete in the amount the question deserved. "Early interest," she said. "There was a scholarship program. The training followed." "When did you know it was what you wanted?" "I'm not sure want is the right word." She paused. "Not for effect, for accuracy. I understood pretty early it was the most interesting problem available to me. The physics of it, the way the skill compounds. It was the thing I wanted to keep getting better at." A small pause. "That's usually how I know if something's worth the time." Odalis was listening to this, hearing it, and underneath the hearing, aware that she was waiting for a version of the answer that would place her somewhere inside it. The cafeteria, the whispers, the people at the table behind Sutton who'd talked loud enough to carry on purpose. She was waiting to find out if she'd been a factor in anything. The answer didn't contain her. The answer was complete without her. This, she was slowly understanding, was worse than being in it. At 9:15, Bartholomew tapped the microphone twice, and the room's attention gathered toward the stage with the practiced ease of a crowd that's been at an event long enough to respond to that specific sound automatically. "All right, everybody, if you'll settle back in, we're going to get to the part of the evening a lot of you have been asking about." Marguerite Doyle stood beside him at the microphone stand, a folder of printed submissions in her hand, and there was something in her posture, a very slight overcorrection, a stiffness that hadn't been there an hour ago, that Odalis, watching from her table, couldn't quite place yet. She would place it soon enough. "We collect these throughout the year," Bartholomew went on. "Alumni updates, how the decades treated everybody. We read them in the order we got them, no favorites, no rankings, just the honest timeline of who sent what, when." He started reading. The submissions took the shape they always take at these things. Careers named, cities named, families acknowledged in the practiced short of people, making a public statement about a private life, and knowing full well the statement will be absorbed in a room where everyone else is quietly composing their own. Some were modest. Some performed modesty over something that wasn't modest at all. There was real texture in the differences, 40-some individual choices about what a decade adds up to when you have to say it out loud, in front of people who knew you before any of it happened. Sutton listened to some of it. Not all. Her attention stayed mostly on the water glass, on the middle distance, the same unhurried focus she'd given everything else that night. Not performing patience. Simply present in the chair, the way she was present in any chair oriented. Not restless. Waiting the way she'd wait through a pre-flight sequence, item by item, until the relevant part arrived. Behind the registration table, 10 minutes earlier, Odalis had gone looking for a restroom, and had taken a wrong turn toward the service hallway instead, and had come around the corner just in time to hear Marguerite's voice, low, urgent, half a phone pressed to one ear, saying something that stopped her mid-step. "No, I know. I invited her on purpose. Obviously I pause. Someone on the other end saying something back. Because it makes the night memorable, that's why. Everybody's been talking about that photo for a week. I wasn't going to let the reunion just be folding chairs and a slideshow. I wanted another pause, longer. I didn't think she'd actually show. That was the whole." Marguerite's voice cracked slightly, caught itself, hardened back into something composed. "I have to go. She's here." "Yeah, she's actually here." Odalis had stood frozen in the service hallway for 3 full seconds before backing away, quiet, and returning to the ballroom by a different route. She hadn't said anything to anyone. Not yet, but she carried it now, the way she carried everything else. That night, a fact added to a ledger she was only just beginning to understand she'd been keeping. Marguerite Doyle had not invited Sutton out of any obligation to fairness or tradition. She had invited her because of the photo, because a room needed a story, and Sutton, unknowing, uninvolved, 3 states and 1 entire career away from any of them, had been quietly cast as the story's centerpiece. A bet. That was the word Odalys kept circling back to. Marguerite had placed a bet that Sutton either wouldn't come, and the joke would simply hang there all night, ripening, or that she would, and the room would get a spectacle out of it either way. She hadn't accounted for a third outcome. She hadn't accounted for an Apache. The submissions moved on. 31, 32. The room's attention drifted in and out, the way attention does during a list. Partial focus and side conversation running at a murmur underneath the microphone. Servers still moving quietly along the periphery. Bartholomew reached submission 41. He paused, a half-second longer than the pauses before it, just long enough to register as a pause and not quite long enough to read as a decision. Sutton, Ashwell, he read. Captain, United States Army, Rotary Wing, currently attached to the 147th Aviation Regiment, Fort Dunmore. He looked up from the sheet, found her at table 6 without seeming to search for her. Looked back down, continued. His voice hadn't changed register, because the register he was using was the level, even tone of a man reading a list, and he was reading a list. Recipient of the Army Aviator Badge. Selected for Advanced Qualification Training 2024. He turned the page. Additionally, a note submitted with this entry. The room had been doing what rooms do during a list. Partial attention, side murmurs. Servers moving along the edges. It kept doing that for another half-second, and then the partial attention shifted. The way it does when something inside a list stops matching the pattern of the list around it. Bartholomew, read on. A scholarship in the amount of $12,000 per year has been established in the name of the 31604 zip code to support students from the local school district who demonstrate strong academic performance and interest in a technical or scientific field, regardless of extracurricular profile. The scholarship is anonymous and awarded through an independent committee. He glanced up again, then back down. This year's recipient is currently enrolled in a student pilot program at Ridgeway Flight Academy. Her name is Naomi Fairweather. She's 22 and in her first year. He set the sheet down. The room did not erupt. There was no surge of applause, no collective gasp, no cinematic shift in the lighting or the music. What happened was quieter than any of those things, and more durable, the noise level dropping by a register that wasn't silence exactly, but was unmistakably different from what it had been 30 seconds earlier. Conversations that had been running at a low murmur simply stopped, the way conversation stops when new information arrives that has to be processed before anything else can be said around it. Corbin was looking down at the printed program card in front of him, the one that had been placed at every table as part of the evening's materials. Folded in half at the start of the night, and now lying open and flat. He was looking at the section Bartholomew had just read aloud, the way you look at something you're rereading. Because the first pass didn't finish landing. Priya was looking at her own hands. The couple at the far end of table 6 were both looking at Sutton, who was looking at the program card in front of her, already read, already fully absorbed, containing no information left to extract. She turned it over. The back was still blank. She set it down. Odalys was looking at the zip code. 31604 wasn't the school's own zip code, exactly. It was the zip code of the neighborhood the school sat in, the zip code of the second-hand suite apartments, the Saturday morning pharmacy shifts, the ground-level break room window that looked out on a loading dock, the small pencil handwriting in library margins that nobody had ever officially explained. The scholarship wasn't named for Sutton Ashwell. It wasn't named for anything a person had done, or been, or achieved in some way that could be printed on a plaque. It was named for a place. It would go on being named for that place long after Sutton's name had faded out of this particular room's memory, after Naomi Fairweather had finished whatever she was working toward and moved on to whatever came next, after every single person in this ballroom had finally become whoever they were, all still quietly in the process of becoming. Odalys thought about the zip code for a long moment. Bartholomew moved on to submission 42. The room slowly resettled around it, not fully, not the way it had been an hour ago, but resettled enough to keep moving forward, the way rooms do, even carrying something they haven't finished absorbing yet. At the far end of the microphone stand, out of the direct light, Marguerite Doyle stood very still. She had known, going in, that Sutton had a military career. That much had been in the RSVP data, in the loose biographical notes the committee kept for these things. She had not known about a scholarship, had not known about a zip code with a dollar figure attached to it, quietly funding some stranger's flight training 4 counties over. She had built tonight around a photograph and a bet, and the woman she'd built it around had, apparently, spent the last several years building something entirely different, in total silence, with absolutely no plan to ever mention it to anyone in this room. Marguerite felt something in her chest that she didn't have an immediate word for. It sat somewhere between embarrassment and something closer to shame, the specific, unpleasant recognition of having spent real effort constructing a story about a person, only to discover, in real time, in front of 40 witnesses, that the actual story had been running the entire time, right alongside hers, completely indifferent to whether she noticed it or not. She set her folder down on the edge of the stage. She did not look toward table 6. She found she couldn't yet. Aldous Rourke was not at the reunion. He had no reason to be. He'd taught no one in that room anything, technically, beyond how to check out a library book and bring it back on time. But he would hear about the scholarship 2 days later from a neighbor whose granddaughter had been at the event, relaying the story secondhand over a fence, and something in his chest would go very still when the zip code came up. He would sit with that for a long while, alone, in the apartment where 2 of his daughter's old textbooks still sat on a shelf nobody else ever looked at. He would not tell anyone, not for a long time, exactly what those margin notes had meant, or where they'd come from, or why a stranger's grief had spent 6 years quietly rerouting itself into a stalker's night shift reading habit. That story belonged to a different part of this one. It hadn't arrived yet, but its shape was already sitting in the room, unnoticed, folded into a scholarship named after a zip code, instead of a person, because Sutton, without ever having met the man who'd left those notes in her books, had learned the exact same lesson he had, that the kindest thing you can do for someone struggling in the dark is leave them an instruction instead of an explanation. Figure this out, she had, over and over, and now, without knowing it, she'd handed the same unsigned gift forward to a 22-year-old named Naomi Fairweather, who had no idea yet whose handwriting, however many steps removed, had shaped the opportunity in front of her. At table 6, Sutton set her water glass down. It touched the linen with a sound so small it barely qualified as a sound at all. She put her hands in her lap, looked at the room, looked past it, toward the east windows, now fully dark against the night, the parking lot beyond them glowing amber at the edges, the security vehicles at the field's perimeter still holding their position. She could see the aircraft's position lights from here. Red on the left, green on the right. Steady, patient, waiting in the dark grass below the lot's boundary. She looked at them for a moment. Then she stood, took her jacket from the back of the chair, and walked unhurried toward the terraced doors at the south end of the room. Nobody stopped her. Nobody quite dared to. Behind her, the room kept moving through submission 43, 44. The low hum of ordinary conversation slowly reclaiming the space it had lost, but underneath it, something had shifted permanently, in a way that wasn't going to be undone by the rest of the program. No matter how many more names Bartholomew read off that list, Odalys watched her go, and felt, for the first time all night, the actual shape of what she'd been carrying since the moment that photograph went up in the group chat. Not guilt exactly. Guilt was too simple a word for it. It was the recognition arriving late, arriving heavy, that the version of Sutton Ashwell this entire room had spent 10 years quietly agreeing to remember had never once been the real one, and that the real one had just walked past all of them out onto a dark terrace, without asking a single person in this ballroom for permission to exist exactly as she was. Odalys set her drink down, stood, and for the second time that night, started moving, before she'd finished deciding to. The terrace door was propped open with a rubber wedge. Wedge had been since sometime around 8, because the night was warm enough to make the outdoor air a relief and cool enough to make it worth stepping into. Through the gap, sound came from both directions at once. The ballroom behind it, low and murmuring, still working its way through submission 40-something, and the field beyond the railing, quiet except for the idle tick of cooling rotor metal and the occasional low crackle of a security radio. Sutton stood at the east railing with both hands flat against the stone. Below her, past the manicured slope, past the boundary, where the parking lot's amber light gave out to real dark, the Apache sat exactly where she'd left it, position lights holding their pattern, red on the left, green on the right. Steady the way a held breath is steady, right up until it isn't anymore. She could see Colton near the perimeter vehicles, talking with one of the base security officers. Relaxed posture. The particular ease of two professionals at the tail end of a day that had gone according to plan. He didn't look up, had no reason to. She'd given him the 2200 time check. He'd hold it without being reminded twice. She let out a breath she hadn't noticed holding, because the room behind her had done exactly what she'd expected it to do the second Bartholomew read her name off that list, which was freeze, recalculate, try to fold $12,000 and a zip code into whatever story it had been telling itself about her for the last 10 years, which was fine. That was their math to do, not hers. She had never once expected to walk into a scholarship reveal, never planned it. The submission form had asked for an optional note, and she'd filled it out, the way she filled out every form accurately, to keep completely, without embellishment. And if that accuracy happened to detonate quietly in the middle of somebody's dinner service, that wasn't a strategy. It was just what was true. The night air smelled like cut grass and jet fuel residue, and the specific mineral cold that shows up after a warm day finally lets go of its heat. She breathed it in, let it back out. Somewhere behind her, the terrace door moved, not opened wide, just eased. The way you ease a door when you're trying to manage the sound of it. Footsteps on the stone. Uneven. The particular gait of someone who isn't sure they're allowed to be exactly where they currently are, which produces a walk that's neither hesitant nor committed. Just in progress, Sutton didn't turn around. The footsteps stopped roughly 15 feet behind her, and to the left. She kept her hands on the railing, kept her eyes on the aircraft. Odalys stood in the gap of the half-open door for a second longer than she meant to. Because she still didn't have a plan. Hadn't had one crossing the ballroom. Hadn't had one on the stairs. Hadn't had one in the 3 seconds it took to push the terrace door open wider and step through it into the cold. Whatever was pulling her out here had already started pulling before her mind caught up and started asking questions about it. Inside, she could still hear the tail end of the program. Bartholomew's voice, low and even, working through the last dozen submissions, the sound of a room that had mostly resumed itself on the surface, while something underneath it had not resumed at all. She thought about a cafeteria. Specifically a cafeteria in the spring of a year she didn't like remembering in detail, and a table everyone at Oakfield Regional had silently agreed was the table worth wanting, and a name her own called, across 3 tables, by someone whose opinion had mattered more to 16-year-old Odalys than it should have. Come sit with us. She'd gone. Not because she'd particularly wanted to, because not going carried a cost she hadn't been prepared to pay at 16. In a school where that cost was very real and very visible and lasted exactly as long as everyone decided it should. She'd sat there for 2 years, learned the price of the table, which turned out to be a willingness to participate in its economy, a currency built entirely out of other people's smallness. The way you pay for things you're ashamed of, hoping the whole time that nobody was keeping count. Someone had been keeping count. She wasn't sure, standing on this terrace, that It had been Sutton. That wasn't quite what she meant. She meant the ledger existed whether or not anyone ever audited it, and she'd been carrying a balance on it for 10 years without fully admitting the balance was hers. "I was in the cafeteria once," she said, "when they were talking about your shoes." Her voice came out smaller than she'd planned for it to. Sutton didn't turn. "It was February," Odalis said. "The pair you had the week after winter break. They laughed about them." She stopped, made herself keep going. "I laughed. And then I didn't, but I had already." The night held still around that sentence. Ventilation hum from the hotel's exterior units. The distant patient idle of the security vehicles. The faint carry of the ballroom through the gap in the door. Not silence. A space in which what she'd just said could sit without anyone rushing to fill it. "February," Sutton said finally. "Yes, I don't remember the shoes." A pause. "I mean that literally. I had 2 pairs that whole year, and I couldn't tell you today which one was which month." Odalis absorbed that. Didn't know what to do with it yet. "You don't have to remember them." "No." Sutton's voice stayed level, not cold. Just precise. The way it had been precise all night, in every sentence she'd offered anyone. "I mean, I genuinely don't. But I remember February. A beat. That was the week I got a lift calculation right for the first time. The whole sequence, from first principles. Without checking the answer key first, she let that sit. "I remember February," she said again. "Just not the part you're describing." Odalis felt something crack open in her chest that she didn't have an immediate name for, because she'd spent 10 years assuming quietly, in the specific way you assume things you never examine closely enough to be wrong about, that the cafeteria had landed. That whatever had been said at that table, behind the 3rd row of windows, had reached its target the way it was designed to. That somewhere inside Sutton Ashwell there was a version of 16 still flinching from it, and instead there was a woman who remembered that exact week, as the week a math problem finally clicked. Which meant the cafeteria hadn't hurt Sutton the way Odalis had spent a decade believing it had, which was worse, somehow. Standing here, it was worse than the alternative, because it meant the cruelty had cost nothing to its intended target, and everything to the people who'd participated in it. It meant the whole architecture of that year, the table, the whispered jokes, the careful social math everyone had run constantly, about who was safe to laugh at and who wasn't, had been built entirely around a person who was somewhere else the whole time, inside a calculation, somewhere the table simply didn't reach. "I'm sorry," Odalis said. "I know that's not something you need from me, but I've been carrying it, and I don't have anywhere better to put it." Sutton was quiet for a moment. "Then I know you laughed," she said. "Yes, and I know you stopped." Odalis opened her mouth, closed it again. "I don't know who stopped and who didn't, in any specific instance," Sutton said. "I want to be accurate about that, but I know the general shape of it." She turned around finally, and the terrace's ambient light caught her face, the same expression she'd worn all evening. Patient. Complete, not performing anything for anyone. "You stopped." Odalis looked at her. "That's in the record," Sutton said. "The stopping is in the record, the same way everything else is." She wasn't offering forgiveness. Not the clean, cinematic kind, not the kind where the account closes, and everyone gets to walk away lighter than they arrived. She was offering something smaller, and somehow more durable than that. A fact, logged accurately, sitting next to every other fact from that year, without being allowed to erase any of them. The stopping didn't undo the laughing. The laughing didn't undo the stopping. Both were true. Both stayed true. That was the whole architecture of how Sutton moved through the world, the same principle Thackeray had handed her in a debrief years ago. In a room that smelled like chart paper and burnt coffee, and which she had apparently decided to apply to every relationship she'd ever have for the rest of her life. The record wasn't selective. Odalis nodded. Found she couldn't say anything that felt accurate enough for this particular terrace, at this particular moment, and so she said nothing. The nothing was the right amount. Sutton turned back toward the railing. "I should go back in," Odalis said. "Sure." Odalis turned toward the door, stopped with one hand on the frame. "Naomi Fairweather," she said. The name they read tonight. A pause. "She's going to figure it out, eventually. whose zip code that actually was. Sutton didn't turn around this time either. Yes, she said. She is. Odalus let the door close behind her, and the warmth of the ballroom rolled back over the gap, along with Bartholomew's voice, still going, still reading names off, a list that suddenly felt very small, compared to everything that had happened around it. Sutton stood at the railing a while longer. She thought about Naomi Fairweather, 22, currently at Ridgeway, working through whatever version of the introductory material Naomi had landed on, in whatever room she'd claimed as her own version of that library nook with the windows facing the wrong direction and the good light for exactly 3 hours a day. Naomi didn't know yet that a zip code was a person. She'd know eventually. Probably not from a program card read aloud at a hotel banquet. Probably from a scholarship renewal letter or a stray line in some administrative paperwork. Or more likely than either, she'd simply never find out at all, and it wouldn't matter, because the money didn't need her gratitude to keep doing its job. That had been the entire design of it. Sutton hadn't built it to be discovered. She'd built it to be useful. The fact that Bartholomew had read it out loud tonight, in front of 40 witnesses, was an accident of paperwork, not intention. She'd checked a box on a form that asked if committee-submitted alumni updates could be shared publicly. And she'd checked it honestly, without imagining anyone would actually get to the bottom of a 47-name list before the servers ran out of patience with the third course. She thought briefly about the library, about a specific white margin years ago and a small precise handwriting that wasn't hers. Figure this out. She had never once found out who wrote it, had assumed for years that she never would. That particular thread hadn't finished unspooling yet. She didn't know that. Not this part of the night. She took her hands off the railing, went back inside. Corbin Wexley had spent the alumni update segment doing something he wasn't used to doing at events like this, which was sitting very still and saying very little. Because the math wasn't landing the way he wanted it to land, he'd walked into tonight. With the story already loaded the group chat photo, the reunion invitation nobody expected her to answer, a night that was supposed to confirm, one more time, the same social order that had organized every room he'd ever walked into. Since he was 14 years old, he was the guy people laughed with. She was the joke. That arithmetic had held for a decade without ever once requiring maintenance. An Apache helicopter did not fit into that arithmetic. Neither did a scholarship with a dollar figure attached to it, quietly funding some strange flight training 4 counties over, structured with more discipline and more follow-through than Corbin had applied to a single thing in his entire adult life. He'd finished his wine, poured another, told himself the discomfort in his chest was second-hand embarrassment on Marguerite's behalf for orchestrating a night that had clearly slipped its own leash. It wasn't second-hand. He knew that. He just wasn't ready to sit with the alternative yet. So when Sutton came back through the terrace doors and crossed toward table 6, unhurried, exactly the way she'd crossed the ballroom the first time, Corbin stood up, because standing up felt like doing something. And doing something felt better right now than sitting still with whatever this actually was. Hey, he caught her 3 tables away from her own, angled his body into her path with the same easy confidence he'd used on every hallway, every conference room, every room he'd ever walked into believing it belonged to him by default. Ashwell Sutton, been a minute, huh? Sutton stopped, looked at him, waited. Big night, Corbin said, and something in his tone was reaching for the old register light, performative, the joke-adjacent voice he used on everyone, the one that had always worked because nobody had ever made him find out what happened when it didn't. Helicopter and everything. You really know how to make an entrance. A few people at the nearby tables had gone quiet. Not obviously the particular quiet of people pretending to be occupied with their own plates while listening completely. I wasn't trying to make one, Sutton said. Sure. Corbin laughed, short, a little too fast. I mean, hey, no hard feelings about the the chat thing. That was just He waved a hand, vague, gesturing at some imaginary category that could absorb the entire incident without him having to name it directly. People get bored. Nostalgia gets weird. You know how it is. I read it, Sutton said. The words landed flat, not raised, not sharp, just entirely without give. Corbin's smile held for a second longer than it should have. The caption, Sutton said. Anyone heard from her? Pretty sure she still lives with her mom. A beat. Word for word. Sunday. 9:41 in the evening. The quiet at the nearby tables stopped pretending to be quiet about something else. You forwarded it to at least 6 people that I know of, Sutton continued, in the same level voice she'd used on the terrace, on Marguerite, at the registration table, on every sentence she'd spoken since walking through those doors. One of them screenshotted your reaction. A laughing emoji. Timestamped 1 minute later. That's okay, that's not... Corbin's voice had lost its ease somewhere in the last 4 seconds and hadn't found it again. That's not exactly. It's exactly, Sutton said. That's the part that matters. It's exactly what happened. I'm not describing an impression of it. I'm describing the record. Nobody at the surrounding tables was pretending to eat anymore. I'm not here to make you feel a particular way about it, Sutton said. I don't actually care how you feel about it. I care that the room heard the accurate version once, out loud, since apparently that hadn't happened yet. Corbin opened his mouth. Nothing useful arrived to fill it. I live with my mother, Sutton said. Roughly as much as anyone lives with their family when they're stationed 9 hours from home. And she happens to have the guest room. Which is to say, never. I haven't lived with her since I was 19. A pause, precise as everything else she'd said tonight. That part wasn't even accurate. It was just cruel and lazy at the same time. Usually you only get one. Somewhere behind him, Odalis had gone very still, watching this unfold with an expression that looked less like satisfaction and more like relief, the particular relief of watching a wrong finally get named out loud in a room by the one person with the standing to name it, instead of continuing to live only in the private ledgers of everyone who'd witnessed it and said nothing. Corbin looked around, found no allies in any direction. The cluster that had laughed with him an hour ago, at this same joke, in this same room, had somehow evaporated into individual people with individual faces, none of them willing to meet his eyes. He started. You don't need to apologize to me specifically, Sutton said, before he could finish whatever half-formed sentence he'd been reaching for. I'm genuinely fine. I have been fine for 10 years. That's not a performance. It's just true. A small pause. But you might want to think about why an 11-word caption felt like the most interesting thing you could contribute to a room full of people you grew up with. She didn't wait for an answer. She stepped around him, the way she'd stepped around every obstacle. All night, not confrontationally, not triumphantly, just efficiently, the way you navigate around anything standing between you and where you're actually headed, and walked the rest of the way to table 6. Corbin stood alone in the gap between tables for a long moment. Then he sat back down, didn't pour another glass, didn't say anything else for the remainder of the evening. The room, slowly, returned to its own business, but something in its temperature had shifted permanently. In the way rooms shift when they've just watched a piece of accepted social furniture get quietly, irreversibly rearranged. Marguerite Doyle watched the whole exchange from her position near the stage, and felt the last of her carefully constructed evening dissolve completely, because she'd built tonight on a bet that Sutton either wouldn't come, letting the joke ripen untouched all night, or that she would, and the room would get its spectacle either way. She'd never once accounted for a third outcome, the one where Sutton arrived, said almost nothing about the thing that had been done to her, and simply let the accuracy of a scholarship and 11 correctly quoted words do all the necessary work by themselves. Marguerite thought about the phone call in the service hallway, about the sentence she'd said out loud, not knowing anyone could hear her. I invited her on purpose, obviously. She thought about walking over to table 6 and saying something, an apology, maybe, though she wasn't entirely sure yet what shape it should take, or whether Sutton would want it. or whether wanting it was even the point. She didn't walk over. Not yet. She told herself there'd be time later in the evening. She wasn't sure that was true. She sat with the note being sur for the rest of the program, mostly untouched wine in front of her, and didn't reach for the microphone again until she absolutely had to. The rest of the alumni updates finished around 9:50, and Bartholomew wrapped the segment with the same easy warmth he'd opened it with, though even his voice had picked up a slightly different weight in the last 10 minutes, the tone of a man who understood, without needing anyone to explain it to him, that something real had just happened in a room built for something considerably smaller. Dessert service began. The room's noise climbed back toward its earlier register. Though not quite all the way a residue remained, the way residue always remains after something true gets said out loud, in a space that had spent an entire evening avoiding truth in favor of performance. Sutton sat at table 6 with a slice of something she didn't particularly want and didn't touch. She checked her watch. 21:50. 10 minutes before her own countdown to the field started meaning something. Odalys had drifted back to her own table, but kept looking over, at intervals, the way you check on a fact you're still absorbing to make sure it's still there. At 9:58, Aldous Rourke's name came up in a conversation Sutton wasn't part of. She heard it anyway. Table 6 sat close enough to the neighboring cluster that certain sentences carried, and one of the women at the adjacent table, someone Sutton didn't recognize, maybe a spouse, maybe a +1 with no direct connection to the graduating class at all, was telling a small, unremarkable story about the town's public library, about the elderly man behind the reference desk, who'd worked there for decades, and who everyone in Millbrook Falls seemed to have some small, quiet memory of. Lost his daughter years ago, the woman was saying. Aneurysm, I think. Just out of nowhere. She was in some kind of flight program, I want to say. Terrible thing. He never really talks about it, but my sister said he keeps 2 of her old textbooks on a shelf in his apartment. Just keeps them there. Sutton went very still. She hadn't planned to overhear this. Hadn't planned for any part of tonight to intersect with the library at all that had felt, for years, like a separate compartment of her life entirely, sealed off from the reunion, from the uniform, from any of it. But something in her chest recalculated. Fast, the way it recalculated at 17 minutes into a cross-country leg when a number stopped matching the ground beneath it. Aldous, she hadn't known his first name until just now, had never needed it. He'd always simply been Rourke, or the man at the desk, present and constant across 6 years of renewals and reserve slips, and the particular silence he'd offered her every single time instead of a question. She thought about the margin notes. 2 different books, 2 different hands, both small, both precise, both landing in exactly the white space beside a diagram that hadn't finished explaining itself yet. Figure this out. She had spent years assuming those notes belonged to some anonymous, unremarkable predecessor, a stranger who'd once struggled with the same material, and left a task behind out of nothing more than habit or boredom. She was starting to understand, sitting at table 6 with a slice of untouched cake in front of her, that they had never been anonymous at all, that they belonged to a young woman who died at 21, 3 weeks into a flight science program, in a hospital hallway some grieving father still dreamed about, and that the reserve slips, the quiet copying of handwriting she'd never fully explained, the specific gentleness with which Rourke had always processed her renewals, without ever asking a single question, had all been one long, unspoken act of a man trying to keep his daughter's voice, moving forward through the world in the only form he had left of it. She had built a career, in part, on instructions left behind by a person who was no longer alive to know they'd landed anywhere at all. Sutton set down her fork, looked toward the east windows, though there was nothing new to see. There, just the same dark grounds, the same amber lot lights, the same steady position, lights on an aircraft, waiting exactly where she'd left it. She thought, I need to go to that library, soon, and say something, even if I don't fully know yet what. She filed the thought the way she filed everything carefully, completely, without letting it interrupt whatever came next. At 10:04, Odalys crossed the room one more time, this time without any hesitation at all, and sat down properly at table 6, not at the corner angle this time, but directly across from Sutton, the way you sit across from someone once you've decided. The conversation is actually a conversation and not an intrusion. I heard what you said to Corbin, she said. I assumed most of the room did. It wasn't cruel. Odalys turned her water glass slowly on the linen. That's what got me. You could have made it cruel. Nobody would have blamed you. I wasn't trying to make him feel anything. Sutton's voice held the same evenness it had held all night. I was correcting a record. That's a different exercise. Odalys nodded slowly, like she was turning that sentence over from a few different angles, trying to see where it might apply to other parts of her own life that she hadn't examined closely enough yet. Can I ask you something? She said. You can ask. Do you actually forgive any of it? Not the specific facts you're keeping straight. I mean underneath that. Do you actually feel differently about any of us than you did back then? Sutton considered the question with the same care she gave everything. I don't think forgiveness is really the mechanism I use, she said. I think what I do is closer to accounting. I keep the record accurate. I let people's actual behavior, over time, tell me what to wait and what to set aside. A pause. You stopped laughing. That's weighted. Corbin forwarded a lie to 6 people and laughed about it a minute later. That's weighted differently. Neither one requires me to feel any particular way about either of you. It just requires me to be accurate. That sounds exhausting. It's the opposite, actually. Sutton almost smiled, the closest thing to it Odalys had seen all night. The carrying an inaccurate account of something is exhausting. This is just bookkeeping. Odalys laughed, quietly, surprised by it. I don't think I've ever heard anyone describe forgiveness as bookkeeping. I don't think I'd call it forgiveness, Sutton said. I think I'd call it not letting the wrong version of the story keep running unchallenged. That's not the same thing. It's smaller. It's more useful. At 10:11, Sutton's watch buzzed once, a discreet reminder she'd set herself hours earlier, back when tonight was still and seems an abstraction, rather than a room full of people rearranging their understanding of her in real time. She stood. I have to go, she said. 2200 window. Colton's probably already staged. Odalys stood too, quickly, like she wasn't ready for the conversation to end but understood there wasn't a version of tonight where it could extend indefinitely. Will you? She stopped. Started again. I don't even know what I'm asking. Will you come back sometime? Not for a reunion. Just... I don't know, Sutton said honestly. I'm not big on return trips to places that only remember one version of me. A pause. But the town's still where my library card is. That part I'll probably be back for. Odalys nodded, accepting that as the honest, unglamorous answer. It was no grand promise, no cinematic reconciliation, just a fact laid down plainly, the way Sutton laid down every fact. Thank you, Odalys said, for not making tonight worse than it needed to be. You could have. I wasn't interested in worse, Sutton said. I wasn't interested in accurate. She picked up her jacket, looked once more toward the east windows, where the position lights still held their pattern in the dark field below. Then she turned and walked toward the terrace doors, and this time she didn't stop at the railing. She continued past it, down the exterior stairwell that led to the grounds, out onto the flagstone path she'd walked in on less than 2 hours earlier. The night had gotten colder. The grass held more dew than it had at 7:30. Colton was waiting at the aircraft, exactly where she expected him, posture relaxed but alert, the particular readiness of someone who'd never once needed to be told twice. Ready when you are, Captain. Copy. She checked her watch. Right on schedule. She climbed into the cockpit and ran the pre-flight the way she always ran it. Item by item. Nothing skipped. Nothing rushed. Behind her, through the aircraft's canopy, the hotel's east face glowed with its ordinary lit windows. The ballroom's floor-to-ceiling glass, now mostly returned to its normal texture, people moving, sitting, standing, dessert plates being cleared, the low murmur of an evening winding down toward its natural end. Somewhere inside that glow, 40-some people were going to spend the drive home tonight quietly revising a decade's worth of assumptions. Some of them would let the revision matter. Most of them, probably, would let tonight fold itself back into an anecdote by next week, softened at the edges, easier to carry that way. That wasn't Sutton's problem to solve. She'd never intended it to be. She started the engine sequence. The rotor began its slow initial turn, gathering speed, gathering the specific vibration that had lived in her hands and the back of her neck for years now, familiar the way library nook light had once been familiar, the way cafeteria noise had once been background instead of threat. Colton climbed in beside her, ran his own checklist in parallel, quiet, efficient. Clear for departure whenever you are, Captain. She looked once more at the hotel, at the ballroom glass, at the specific spot behind it where table 6 sat, where a woman named Odalis Brennicke was probably still standing near the window. Watching the aircraft's position lights the way you watch something you're trying to memorize on purpose. Sutton lifted off. The grounds fell away below her in stages: the flagstone path, the manicured slope, the boundary where amber parking lot light gave out to full dark. The hotel shrank to a lit rectangle against the night, then to a scatter of individual windows, then to nothing distinguishable at all. She climbed to 4,000 feet, leveled off, checked her heading against the navigation display. Below her, the city was a slow scatter of orange and white, the same as it had been on the way in, the same as it would be on the way home, the same as it would probably always be from this exact altitude, at this exact hour, no matter how many more times she made this particular flight, in whatever years were still ahead of her. She adjusted her heading 2 degrees west for wind. The correction cost nothing. Took 3 seconds. Produced a track that was accurate instead of merely close, which was the only kind of track she'd ever considered worth flying. 3 weeks later, at Ridgeway Flight Academy, in a study room with fluorescent lighting, and a window that faced the wrong direction for good afternoon light, Naomi Fairweather sat with a library copy of an intermediate aerodynamics text open in front of her, working through a section on energy management in rotary wing flight. She was 22. She had grown up 2 towns over from Millbrook Falls, in a household where flight training had never once been discussed as a realistic option until a scholarship letter arrived with her name on it and a zip code where her own signature should have been. She hadn't questioned the zip code too hard. Scholarships were strange that way, sometimes funded through foundations, trusts, committees with names nobody bothered to trace back to an actual person. She'd been grateful and had moved forward, and hadn't spent much time wondering who, exactly, had decided a 22-year-old from that particular corner of the county deserved $12,000 a year to chase something that difficult. She was 3 chapters in, working through a problem that required her to hold several values in her head at once while she worked out the intermediate steps, the way the older texts always seemed to ask of her. Right at the point where the material stopped at being simple, she found the answer, wrote it in her own notebook, a cheap spiral one, not the expensive kind, because she didn't yet know that this was a pattern, that this particular kind of notebook had belonged to somebody else once too, years before her, in a different town, in a different reading nook, with different light. She turned the page. In the narrow white margin, beside a cross-section diagram, faint pencil, small and precise handwriting she didn't recognize, sat 2 words. Figure this out. She looked at it for a long moment. Read it the way you read something true, not needing your agreement to be accurate, but earning it anyway. She didn't know whose handwriting it was, didn't know it had traveled through 3 different owners now, across 2 different libraries, carried forward each time by someone who'd found the same white space and felt the same impulse, and hadn't been able to resist leaving something behind for whoever came next. She didn't dog-ear the page, didn't mark it in any other way. She read the note, agreed with it, turned back to the diagram, kept going.